Right, good morning everybody. Thanks for being here. Yesterday we had a very informative visit to New Plymouth. I was joined by Nicola Willis, our education spokesperson, as well as Chris Bishop, our infrastructure spokesperson, and Jonathan Young, the MP for New Plymouth. We met with Marfell School principal and the chair of the board, plus the principal of the New Plymouth Boys High. What was really clear is the absolute anger amongst the school principals and the school communities about the $11.7 million that has been promised by the government to this thing called a green school, when the schools themselves in New Plymouth, many are suffering, and particularly Marfell and Boys High, from a deficit of infrastructure, particularly around the school buildings. The message from Marfell was very clear. It's a Decile 1 school. The principal spends 4 out of 5 days a week trying to fundraise. They have no extra money from parents because the parents don't have any extra money at all. They're absolutely reliant on essentially community trusts, particularly pokey funds, to actually be able to buy anything for their school, including the principal having to make the curtains, donated television, donated IT equipment, much of which is now 10 years old. And they're looking at this green school, private school, and wondering what is going on with the government, and they certainly did not expect that that would happen. So we will be prosecuting this issue today with the government. We will be also we're very focused on the $2 billion, the Fix New Zealand Schools Alliance that we announced yesterday, which is to deal with these particular issues that we saw in Marfell and also New Plymouth Boys High and all around the country. And of course the $2.8 billion for new schools over the next 10 years, which is twice what the current government has allocated. We believe very much that New Zealand children deserve decent schools to study in, and we believe very much that teachers deserve decent schools to work in. When we came to government in 2008, we came in with, in the school property area, a complete mess left for us. You'll recall that there was a 2006 Auditor General's report on school buildings, which showed that there was almost no system, no plan in place as to what was going to be fixed and what was not. 2 schools in my electorate, the Gardens and also Red Hill Primary School, were amongst schools that the national government had to entirely rebuild from scratch. Other schools had buildings that were renewed, and that is true all over the country. So we are obviously now facing another problem with school buildings, and we have a plan for that. We also think it's important in a time of unemployment where there are 400 people a day losing their jobs, certainly from last week anyway, that we will be very focused on making sure that small businesses as well as medium and larger businesses are involved in this school rebuild we've got planned. Do we have any questions on this?
You've outlined a pretty bleak situation for Marfell and New Plymouth Boys High. Is National committing today to pumping more money into those schools, given that you've said that 4 out of 5 days a week they're trying to fundraise?
Well, I think it's really clear that they do need more money. If we know anything, we must know that the children from low decile homes, people where there's no extra money, that the teachers there have to try so much harder to deal with a situation where there is this problem. But Nicola might want to deal with any of the detailed issues on that.
But are you committing to funding those schools?
We're committing to funding schools, and clearly Marfell School is one of those schools, and New Plymouth Boys High, where they have absolute need. So Nicola will deal with the actual individual issues.
I think, Jason, we don't want to be like the government who clearly did not do due diligence on the Green School, who clearly did not create a fair, contestable process. So we won't be signing contracts in the newspaper today. But what we are doing is providing a significant sum of additional funding, $2 billion over 5 years, and we are very confident that projects that need to happen, such as those at Marfell School, will qualify. And not only will we fund them, but we will get them done faster.
No, not at all, actually. The last... Yep.
$393 million, which is a lot lower than 2019, which was almost $1 billion. Was there too much penny pinching on this in the last national government?
So, Henry, if you look over those numbers, you'll see that over the course of the national government, we invested more than $5 billion in school property, and the amount of money that we invested in school property increased each year that we were in office. And yes, that trend has continued under this government, but there is so much more work to do. This is a question about priorities. What is the priority for investment? Either side of Parliament have acknowledged that we are going to be borrowing. The question is, what sort of assets do we invest in? And our priority is investing in fixing up our schools, not in an $11.7 million grant for the Green School.
Judith Collins, what do you think of concerns about the curriculum at the Green? Do you have any concerns about the curriculum at the Green School given those revelations yesterday? This couple who thinks that COVID is a manufactured natural disaster and held a DNA activation event at the school. Do you have any concerns about the curriculum being taught at the Green School?
Well, of course, independent schools do have more choice over their curriculum, but I've certainly found that in New Plymouth that there's possibly not a huge amount of support for growing crystals and planting them. I thought that was a doozy, but I've got to say it's an interesting one. Jane? Yes, I do. If there is a contract, well, we don't know that there is a contract yet. We haven't actually had the Minister of Finance and others front up from the government. If there's no contract, then they should cancel everything now on it. If there is a contract, then they're going to have to explain to the people of New Zealand why they thought this was such a great thing.
Would you like to see the business case on which this was signed off originally, given some of the economic benefits and claims that go along with it being granted?
Yes, it would be very good to see a business case. It should be very good to see all of the documentation around this, including the advice from officials, and I particularly would like to see the Treasury advice on this.
Back to your comments about school maintenance, do you take any responsibility as a minister in the previous national government for the state that New Zealand schools are still in?
Well, as we said, 2006, when the Labour government was in under Helen Clark, the Auditor General's report was really clear. The whole school funding programs was a complete mess with no rhyme nor reason for how projects were put in place. We had to do quite a lot. We spent $5 billion over 9 years, which is a big spend. Actually, I thought we did well, but we need to do even better. We got 2 entire schools rebuilt in Papakura.
Are you in a position to criticise the government for the state of the school stock, given national threat?
We did a very good job in the time that we had, but obviously we would like to do more. Thank you.
Testing port workers, the Minister of Health revealed this morning that only about 300 or 400 of those port workers have been tested in the second round out of 10,000. Is that good enough?
Does it sound like another broken promise? I think it's very challenging for the government to now be trying to play catch-up after we're being yo-yoing in and out of lockdowns. I think the issue is really clear. If people are, and as we've seen from the maintenance work at the Ridges Hotel, even being in a proximity and putting hands onto a site, a surface where COVID-19 has, this is a very contagious disease. So I would have thought wherever it is possible, there should be the testing going on.
Is the government taking the risk of the ports seriously enough?
Well, I don't know that they are, particularly after it's now been some matter of weeks and genomes seem to have been sequenced all over the place, that the government cannot yet, with any assurance, tell us how COVID-19 got through. And clearly it's not just one instance. So ports are also airports and seaports. They both need to be taken seriously. We also need to keep in mind the fact that we have chains of supply chains to deal with, but that doesn't mean to say that New Zealanders should be given COVID-19 because of that.
Does national stand by its education policy, its national education policy allowing students to quarantine inside university accommodation?
Well, it was certainly put out by a previous leader that was something we could look at. I think the fact is that what we're seeing is that the quarantining that's been going on hasn't been necessarily optimal. So whatever we do around that, we need to make sure we have in place the COVID testing, the COVID apps, the COVID, a Bluetooth type system for people in or around those areas, but also that we have confidence that we could actually stop it. What we've seen is that the government hasn't done a brilliant job, and we wouldn't be putting anything in that wasn't safe. So no policy without this being safe. I have no reason to believe that we can't do it. Taiwan can do it. Why can't we do what we need to do? And that's about keeping New Zealanders safe.
Are you in lockstep with the government on the current alert level settings? And specifically, can I ask you, is there a reason why South Island shouldn't be at alert level 1?
Well, I've been down the South Island the last few days and end of last week, and I can tell you people in Invercargill were wondering why they're in a level 2. And they were very grumpy about it. So I had to say that we had to rely on the advice from the government. Dr. Shane might want to say something to that one.
Sure. So we are dependent on the information that we have. Clearly, the government has more information, but these are some of the questions that we'll be raising at Select Committee at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning.
Can you just clarify the position on having international students coming back into the country? Are you saying that it would be off the table at the moment?
Yes, only when it's safe, not bringing anybody in when it's not safe. And that involves, by the way, testing people before they get on a plane to get to New Zealand too.
The policy is still on your website, and the Q&A on your website still says that it should be done as soon as possible. Why wait? It should be, So
does it say that? Does it really say why wait, Henry? Does it really say that?
It's not waiting. It's an advance faster because students would be here for try-free and be able to stay over the summer. Is that still
Well, I want to make it really clear that nothing unless it's safe. And we don't have a system that we can rely on at the moment. The government is very belatedly trying to play catch-up on it, but with a single border agency, we know that we could make things safe.
Clarify what those comments about the South Island. Do you think it would be worth it to put in South Island into level 1 and just having to have those restrictions in between ferries and flights and things like that? Do you think that would be worth it?
Well, I think Dr. Shane sort of answered that. We don't have the same information that the government has, and I think it would be very, very unwise for us to jump to conclusions when we don't have that information. These things happen. We don't worry about it.
Do you think that it's getting, like social media is getting out of control now, especially going into the election season, the attacks are getting too vociferous and visceral? People
will jump to their own conclusions on that, make their own conclusions. I just think I don't deal with them. Yep, thank you.
Would you support increasing sick leave to 10 days?
Well, I think we're very concerned about lack of productivity at the moment, so we've made no decision on that, and we're very focused on making sure that people get back to work if that's at all possible. However, nobody wants COVID-19 coming into their workplace, so we will have to discuss that one. Yep.
Just on the Christchurch terrorist, you've previously made your position quite clear that he should spend the rest of his life in New Zealand, but the Australian Prime Minister says he's willing to keep an open mind, he's open to discussions, and that the views of the family members need to come first. If Scott Morrison's willing to keep an open mind, why can't you?
Well, I guess I'm always wary of the Australian government desperate to take or keen to take back one prisoner when I know they've probably got about 800 to 900 of New Zealanders in prisons now, and they're pretty keen to send them back. I think we also need to be aware on the basis of principle that the crime has been committed here. New Zealand's never had a policy of sending back prisoners while they're still serving out their sentences, so we'd need to be very careful about that. I think it's always easy to take a populist view, as has been taken by the Deputy Prime Minister. Well, I think it's also important to understand that we have the rule of law here, and this man has been sentenced in my opinion, entirely correctly to serve his life entirely in prison without parole. This is not necessarily so in Australia, so we'd need to be very aware of that. And as you know, each state has different rules around these things, so we'd need to be very, very careful. I would like to hope that the mass murderer never sees the light of day, and I think most New Zealanders will be happy with that.
You're not actually, at the time, just so that I'm committed to not saying his name, you haven't used it today either. Is that a same pledge that you've undertaken?
Well, no, I'm not worried about that, but I do know this, that we should spend a lot less time focusing on a mass murderer and a lot more time on focusing on the good people of New Zealand who actually want to have a job, want to get ahead, and want to know that rule of law exists in New Zealand.
Can I change your education policy? In terms of creating a 30-year pipeline of school projects and this Fixing Schools Alliance, are you concerned that appears to double up with the Infrastructure Commission's 30-year infrastructure pipeline? So are you sort of creating another layer of bureaucracy or something there? How are they separate?
Nicola.
How's the Infrastructure Commission's pipeline separate from the education pipeline when there are education projects in the Infrastructure Commission's pipeline?
The Ministry of Education is required to have a national education growth plan that goes through each region of the country and identifies its need for additional classrooms, new schools. That's currently a 10-year process, and what we're saying is, yes, let's have a very detailed 10-year process, but let's also fund it, and then let's look out over the next 30 years to anticipate what future needs might be. So it's quite specific to education.
All right.
Makes sense though to just pop those projects into the Info Commission's, rather than creating a whole separate one, and also relying on the pipeline.
No, they require education expertise.
Right, okay. One more? Yes, sure.
How David is feeling about this?
Oh, well, look, I try not to discuss my family, and I think we just get on, do our jobs, and my job is very much to focus on the 400 people who are losing their jobs every day, and I think people want us to.
To a clean campaign, would you have preferred that you hadn't weighed in?
I think I've got to say is that those are not my actions, and I would not have done that, and I'm sure you all understand that. Thank you.
So let's education. You said when it's safe, you will allow.
Yeah.
Is it ever going to be safe for you to
Yeah, it can be. It can be safe. If you look at Taiwan, and which I think is the standout star achiever of all countries, all, by the way, without the World Health Organization's assistance, what a standout response. Things can be made safe, and it is not impossible. But what it does need is it needs a sole agency. It needs a very clear plan. It needs a very clear line of communication and responsibility, and then it needs a government to actually make it happen. We could do that.
Would you maybe try one next year, maybe?
When it's safe. Thank you.
Do you know what a Lionsgate abundance and manifestation ceremony, including a bioenergy field cleaning and DNA activation, is?
We did not learn that at Walton Primary, and no. Thank you.
Thank you.